Hello, everyone. A few announcements before we start. Of course, turn off your cell phones, as I always remind you. We have a couple of events coming up that I want to let you know about. We have You've Got to Read This. It's going to be our librarians telling you the best summer reads on July the 3rd. We have our next Friday afternoon at the movies, July the 5th. I hear a cell phone. And the next Dr. Joe will actually be on July 4th. It's a Thursday. I know you guys aren't used to that, but put that in your calendars, save the date. And also, hopefully, you all have received your Summer in the City flyers. They should have been mailed to your home. If they were not, you can pick one up on the way out. It will announce all of our summer concerts, including Canada Day and also the Bright Lights Film Festival. So now, without further ado, here's Dr. Schwartz with Science Demystified.
Thank you. I think there was a little bit of a mistake in the title that you saw. My book is Superfoods, Silkworms, and Spandex, not Splenda. I don't know how that happened, but if you like, I can talk about Splenda. It's an artificial sweetener. The only thing I can tell you about artificial sweeteners is that, yeah, they are sweet. They do replace sugar and sweetness, but they're useless. All the studies show that they do not lead to weight loss. There's nothing good that comes out of artificial sweeteners, Splenda or saccharin or aspartame or whatever. Anyway, I don't know how that happened, but it's not Splenda. Okay, so I was asked to talk about the book and some of the stories in there. This is my 20th book, and they all sort of have the same theme, because what I like to do is present interesting stories from everyday life, where the science is not trivialized, and where you find some interesting applications as well. And they're all, they're an easy read. They're not too long, 1,000, 1,200 words each. So you can pick up the book any page. You don't have to read it from page 1 to page 200 or wherever it is. You can open it up anywhere, read it, and say, this is interesting. Next time you go to the bathroom, you take it with you again, open it at a different place. Okay, well, why Superfoods, Silkworms, and Spandex? Because I thought they sort of represent the spectrum of interesting things that can be talked about in everyday life. Superfoods, I mean, most people have some idea what that is. Silkworms are rather unusual. And Spandex, again, it's a word that everyone knows, but you don't know the stories behind it. All right, well, let's get going with superfoods. The term is sort of a nebulous one. I mean, there's no specific definition, but the basic understanding is that it is a food that has some sort of special health property. Okay? That it's more than just the usual nutrition that you'd expect from a food. And when you ask people what superfoods are, they'll tell you, things like this: berries and vegetables and legumes and yogurt. What I'm going to tell you is there's no such thing as a superfood. There are healthy diets and there are unhealthy diets. Okay, yes, these certainly are components of a healthy diet, but you can eat all the blueberries you want and still have a terrible diet. Depends on what else you eat. Or you may never eat yogurt or blueberries and still have a healthy diet. That's why, when people ask me to comment on their diet and they, tell me what they ate that day or whatever, I say, this is useless. You can't do that. If you really want some intelligent commentary on a diet that is, backed by evidence, you have to keep a food diary for at least 2 weeks. You have to write down everything that you eat, including amounts that you eat. And then we can take a look and see, whether or not you're in the right ballpark or not. But a single meal, or that doesn't mean anything. And I never like to say never for anything. So, if you like to have that occasional donut, by all means, go ahead. It just should not be a regular part of the diet. So anyway, I mean, that's the sort of the meaning of superfoods. And although the term superfoods has, that's a recent term, but this idea has been around historically for, thousands of years. We go back to the ancient Egyptians, and they fed garlic to the builders of the pyramids, who incidentally were not Israelite slaves. That's nonsense. That never happened. They weren't slaves at all. The workers who worked on the pyramids, they were workers who were paid. There was a whole village built around the pyramids where they lived, but anyway, so obviously there was a need to make sure that they were well nourished, and they were given garlic because it was believed that that gave extra energy. And if you take a look at the Ebers Papyrus, which dates back to 1500 BC, 1500 BC. The reason it's called Ebers Papyrus is because the archaeologist who found it, his name was Ebers. Anyway, look at some of the stuff. Half an onion and the froth of beer as a delightful remedy against death. Well, it would be interesting if we really did have a remedy against death, but obviously the ancient Egyptians are long gone, so the half an onion and the froth of beer didn't do them much good. But what is interesting about this is that the concept of some specific food having special health properties obviously was something that was talked about. And then Hippocrates, of course, the most famous of the ancient Greek physicians, had all kinds of views on food. He thought that lentils were good for ulcers. And we have no reason to think that lentils are good for ulcers. There's no evidence for that. Lentils certainly are a very healthy food to incorporate into your diet. They're high in protein, low in fat. They got lots of minerals in them, so it's very good food. But for ulcers, I mean, that I don't know where he got that. But anyway, it's just an example of how a specific food was labeled as having some sort of health property. I think that the first time that someone really hit upon a food that had a specific health property for real was James Lind. But that was in the 18th century. And in those days, of course, scurvy was a terrible disease, especially among sailors. Because what did they take along on long ocean voyages in those days? They took along salted meat, dried crackers. That was it. No fresh fruits, no vegetables, because of course there was no way to keep them there was no refrigeration. So they had a lack of vitamin C. And James Lind discovered that by giving citrus fruits to sailors who had scurvy, they were cured of the disease. Better yet, if they were given a ration of either citrus or lime, which is the reason Brits are called limeys, or sauerkraut, which is also high in vitamin C, you could prevent scurvy. But again, it isn't really a superfood. I mean, it worked in the case where people had insufficient intake of vitamin C. It just corrected the deficiency. But if you don't have a deficiency in vitamin C, then the concept of superfood, of course, vanishes. In the 1800s, in the United States, Sylvester Graham was perhaps the world's first health guru. And he also had an idea. His idea was that vegetables were really the healthiest food. And he was on the right track there. Taking all vegetable-eating nations together, they are larger and much better formed race than the flesh eaters. Well, I don't think there was much evidence for that, but he really promoted eating high-fiber foods, like high-fiber bread. That was a superfood. And named after him were the Graham crackers, which also were touted as being a superfood. Incidentally, he did not make the Graham crackers. They were named after him by a company that made them. But really, science entered the food world with Justus von Liebig, who was probably the best known and the best accomplished chemist of the 19th century, although of course there's others that vie for that title. And in 1847, he published a book on the chemistry of food. And he looked at the nutritional values of food. And he also had an idea of a superfood. You're going to like this one. Chocolate is a perfect food, as wholesome as it is delicious, a beneficent restorer of exhausted power, is the best friend of those engaged in literary pursuits. I think you'll find a lot of people who agree with that. But no, chocolate, of course, can be incorporated into a diet, but it certainly is not a superfood. And then along came Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. And what an interesting man he was. He also was a nutritional guru. He also believed in superfoods. Now, the superfood that you're familiar with, of course, was the cereal, cornflakes. And his idea was, and there was some substance to that cereals, because they were high in fiber, kind of behaved like little brooms that cleaned out the intestine. In fact, he promoted it as that. He called them the little brooms that clean. And he, at his sanatorium that he founded in Battle Creek, Michigan, the patients were given cereals because, again, he pushed this as a specific food that had health benefits. Like Graham, he also was a big believer in a whole grain and vegetable diet. A man that lives on pork, fine flour bread, rich pies and cakes and condiments, drinks tea and coffee, uses tobacco, might as well try to fly as to be chaste in thought. This was his idea. The Kellogg story is an absolutely fascinating one. And if you're further interested in it, the movie, The Road to Wellville, is a wonderful movie in which Anthony Hopkins plays Kellogg. And he plays him extremely well. And there's a scene that is in the movie which really portrays a scene that happened in real life many times over. Kellogg would gather the patients in his sanitarium. Now, these generally were people who came there to be cured of diseases they never had. These were the rich hypochondriacs, who came. Anyway, he would give them lectures on the benefits of a vegetarian diet and the detriments of a meat diet. And he would bring a monkey up on stage and take a steak and throw it at the monkey. And the monkey, of course, would want none of that. And then he would throw a banana to the monkey, which the monkey would happily eat. And then he would say, you see, even this dumb animal knows not to eat meat. And of course, they bought that in those days. But anyway, this is recreated in the movie very, very nicely, where there is Anthony Hopkins playing Kellogg, holding the steak, and the monkeys on the other side. But the real life Kellogg was really interesting personality. He really pushed yogurt. I've told you this before, and he was a believer that the bacteria that are present in yogurt, the live bacteria, are great for health. And he would very often use yogurt as therapy with his patients. So here again is Anthony Hopkins playing Kellogg, and he's just consulted with a patient, and the patient had, complaints about digestion, etc. And then Kellogg looks over at his assistant, and he says to his assistant, "Would you please bring in the yogurt?" And the patient is kind of reviled, and he says, Dr. Kellogg, I don't like to eat yogurt." And then Kellogg, with this twinkle in his eye, says, "Well, you won't be eating it." Because Kellogg believed in the yogurt enema. And here it is. This was Kellogg's enema machine, which would be filled with yogurt. The patient would sit in that bathtub-like thing and would get a yogurt enema. And if you are looking for an interesting place to visit, if you're looking for a vacation spot that is a bit out of the ordinary, it's Battle Creek, Michigan. And visit the Kellogg Museum and the sanitarium, which is no longer a sanitarium, but it holds a huge place in American history. So anyway, Kellogg was a health guru who believed in a superfood, and his superfood were cereals. And then moving along in years, we come to J.I. Rodale. Rodale in the around 1950, 1960 was a huge deal in the United States. He was the first real promoter of vitamins, which to him were the superfoods. And he was a big proponent of organic agriculture because he said that organic food is more nutritious, it has more vitamins, which by the way is not true. There's no nutritional difference between conventional food and organic food. You can certainly argue that organic agriculture is less damaging to the environment than conventional agriculture, but there's no nutritional difference. Anyway, very interesting story about Rodale is that he was on a talk show and he had just gotten to saying, "I'll live to 100 unless I'm run down by a sugar-crazed taxi driver." Because of course he was against sugar. And I mean, this is an absolutely true story. And just as he had gotten through saying that, he collapsed and died. Now, it wasn't live. They were recording in the afternoon for that night. This was a Merv Griffin show. Obviously, the show never aired, but there it is. There's no question that this really happened. So it wasn't a sugar-crazed taxi driver that got him. It was heart disease, in spite of the fact that he had his organic and vitamin-enriched diet. All right, now, they still weren't talking about superfoods using that term. I mean, they were talking about certain foods having health benefits, but the word superfood didn't exist. So now we get down to where it comes from. Dr. Sidney Haas, as you can see in the early 1900s, made a name for himself by studying celiac disease. Now, celiac disease is a disease where the body is sensitive to gluten. Gluten is a protein that is found in wheat and barley and some other grains. And people who have celiac disease have to scrupulously stay away from gluten. You can't even have a trace amount because it will cause irritation and make you sick. Well, he studied this and he found that a diet, you can see milk, gelatin, little meat, and bananas was the ideal diet for someone who suffered from celiac disease. Well, this actually worked. The reason it worked is not because any of these foods had any benefit. It worked because of what was not in there, right? There were no grains, so there was no gluten in there. But because this diet worked and it made sick people healthy, as long as your sickness was celiac disease, it got a lot of publicity, especially the bananas. And all of a sudden, bananas became a popular food to be given to children, whether they had celiac disease or not. It was just a misrepresentation of the study. So no, bananas are not a superfood, even though that term now is commonly used to describe it. Yeah, there's certainly nothing wrong with eating bananas. One can even argue that you should have a banana regularly because it is a very good source of potassium. It's a very good source of other minerals. So, I mean, all of these claims are true, but that doesn't make it a superfood. It makes it a food that it's okay to include in your diet. But we still haven't got to the word superfood being used. I mean, this is recent. That we can trace back to 1990 and a British food writer, Michael van Straten. And this is the first time that the word superfood was used in the title of his book. It's an interesting book. What got him interested in this whole business and the idea that there are things like superfoods? It was an existing dietary supplement called Straff, as you can see here portrayed as a superhero. This was a food that was invented by a Swiss biochemist, Walter Strathmeyer, and you can see what it contained. I have no idea what plasmolyzed herbal yeast, what the word plasmolyzed means. It means nothing. It's a made-up word. But anyway, it's some yeast and malt extract and barley and orange syrup. Anyway, his idea was that this was some kind of really healthy food. And one Stratton fell for that. He thought that he was getting healthier by consuming this. And he coined the term superfood specifically for that. But then when he wrote the book, there were other commodities that entered into it that became, superfoods. But what really popularized the whole idea was his collaboration with Barbara Cartland. Barbara Cartland was a prolific writer of, I'm not sure what you would describe it, sort of romance stories. I mean, not great literature, but she wrote hundreds of books, and she was a darling of England. How many of you have ever read any of Barbara Cartland's books? That's all? Aha. Yeah, I mean, prolific writer. Anyway, she got together with von Straten and heard his stories and was convinced that diet was very important. And all of a sudden, she started writing about food. She left all the romance novels behind. She started writing about food, including this one, Vitamins for Vitality. This is worth reading. I'm regarded as Great Britain's health queen. Well, maybe by herself. No one can breathe without me, said Miss Cartland in her no-pause way, adding that she takes about 100 pills daily, all natural vitamins. My latest pill is the new brain pill, she went on. It's made from crushed sheep's brain, plus heart and intrinsic factors. People write to ask me about all their health problems. I answer about 5,000 letters a year. Miss Cartland said a post-war trip to the US with her husband started her on a vitamin kick. By 1950, she had written her first book about vitamins. She and Stratton started a store in London. That was the world's first health food store. And Barbara Cartland also sent Margaret Thatcher some of her vitamins when she thought that Thatcher needed to be energized. I doubt that Margaret Thatcher ever took him because, as you may know, what was her background? She was a research chemist before she became a politician. So I don't think she bought into it. So anyway, that's the story of how superfoods came to be. It was a long historical evolution until the term was actually coined by von Straten. But again, to summarize that whole business, there are no such things as superfoods, but there are some diets that are better than other diets. And today, the better diets are plant-based diets. That's the focus today. And I don't think that one has to be extreme. It's not a question of never eating any meat at all. But I think, obviously when we're over to that side, we're better off than when we're over to this side. But that doesn't make an apple or broccoli or anything into a superfood, because there's no single food that you can subsist on that would deliver everything that you need. All right, so that's the saga of superfoods. And of course, a lot of this is sort of common knowledge. People talk about superfoods, but they don't talk much about silk. And certainly about silkworms, I mean, most people don't even know where silk comes from. They've never given that any thought. But therein lies really a fascinating story. Silk comes from silkworms. They cocoon themselves. and the cocoon is what silk comes from. Anyway, let's start the story with a gift that I was given when I was in elementary school. And that was this. And that's what got me interested. It really was a silk factory. It came with silkworm eggs, which you were supposed to be able to hatch and then watch as they made a cocoon. And when the worm became a pupa and burst out of the cocoon, became a moth, then you would use the cocoon to make the silk. All sounded great. Never worked for me, but it certainly got me interested. And it is a very interesting story, silk and silkworms. This is it's called the silkworm moth. And it looks like, any moth that you would see, but I think it's more interesting. And what you're seeing here are the eggs that it lays. The moth lays hundreds of eggs at a time, hundreds. Very, very prolific. And the eggs hatch, they become a worm. The worm forms a cocoon. Inside the cocoon, it is transformed into a pupa. And when that is ready to come out as a moth, the cocoon breaks open and the moth emerges. Here it is. So here are the silkworm eggs. When they hatch, becomes a silkworm. The silkworm spins a cocoon around itself. That cocoon is made of silk fiber. Inside of that cocoon, the silkworm slowly changes into a moth. And the cocoon breaks open and the moth emerges. And here is the moth emerging out of the cocoon. So just to review, here's a life cycle. So you have the eggs. The eggs become worms. They feed on mulberry leaves. That's the food that they eat. They use the nutrients from the mulberry leaves to spin their silk. And they spin the silk around themselves until it becomes a cocoon. There's a cocoon. Inside of the cocoon, the previous worm starts to metamorphose into the moth. When that metamorphosis is finished, the cocoon bursts open, the moth emerges, lays eggs, go through the cycle again. So really quite fascinating. Now, there is a little footnote to this that animal rights activists are upset about, because when you commercialize silk, what you do is you take the cocoons, which of course still have the live worm inside, and you boil them, because you have to prevent the cocoon from bursting open. So when you spin the silk, the cocoon is boiled, and then you can remove the silk, but the worm inside, of course, is killed. And when you start spinning, this is how it works. So here you have the cocoons. You just take a thread from the cocoon and you start turning the wheel, and it will pull the long thread. The cocoon is one long thread of silk. And you pull it off and you get the silk fiber. And then you use that to weave. And of course, you weave in such a way that the fibers are very close to each other, and presto, there's the silk. This, throughout the ages, was an extremely, extremely valuable commodity. You may have heard the story of the Silk Road. Silk, of course, was originally produced in China, but it was much prized in Europe. So it had to be transported, and there are all the transportation routes that made up the Silk Road. And of course, the trade went back and forth along this Silk Road. All right, well, the interesting thing is not finished yet, because as I told you, the female moth lays all of those eggs. But in order to do that, there is another necessity, and that's the male moth. And this is where there's some really interesting chemistry. It's the chemistry of pheromones. Pheromones are chemicals that are used by one member of a species to attract another member of the same species. So here is the female moth. She has a little gland on her derriere from where she releases a chemical. The male moth has antennae. And those antennae, just like our antennae pick up radio waves, that antenna picks up the pheromone of the female. And he will then know where to find her. He just follows the chemical scent. And then they mate. And then, of course, the eggs get laid and the whole thing starts. Now, interestingly enough, the specific chemical has been isolated. It's called bombicol. And this is the one that eventually finds its way to the male's antenna. And there's some interesting experiments that are done. You can find some videos about this, where they have a male moth and they put a little bit of the pheromone into the container and he goes crazy. He starts flapping his wings, because he knows that there's a female somewhere, but he's disappointed because there actually isn't. There's only a pipette that has dropped the pheromone into the cage. Now, when the silkworms are raised, when they grow, as I told you, they dine on mulberry leaves. That's what these are. But like any animal, any creature, they also have to poop. And they do. There is the silkworm poop. And therein lies another interesting story. Believe it or not, silkworm poop has been used in ancient Chinese medicine. And here it is. It's never quite clear what it is supposed to do, but it is supposed to be healthy for you. As you can see, it's got some mulberry extracts along with the silkworm droppings. Now, this actually has been studied. For example, here, where they actually studied what is in silkworm excreta. And just as you might expect, there are all kinds of compounds in there, because they eat the mulberry leaves, which is a very complex chemical entity. So of course, there's going to be all kinds of stuff in their poop. And you can make a case for some of those substances possibly being healthy, because there will be vitamins and minerals in there, just like there are in human poop, right? And one, of course, could, with a little bit of inventiveness, even make a case for that. But here they make a case for silkworm poop. And you can even go online and buy pillows that are filled with silkworm excrement. And they promise to give you a better sleep, make you healthier, etc. Supposedly, as you're sleeping, the chemicals somehow get released into the air. If you don't want to do that, if you don't want to spend that money on a silkworm excrement pillow, you can try it yourself, because you can actually purchase silkworm excrement. As you can see, you can go on Amazon, and there you go. There's the silkworm excrement. You can put them into your own pillowcase and see what happens. I suspect nothing will. But you see why silkworms are so interesting. Here is something, silk. I mean, we, wear silk and kind of know what silk is, but you never really think about all of the science that's in there, all of the interesting facets, of how that silkworm actually spins the silk and makes a cocoon. But there's another story that I like to tell, which is actually one of the reasons that I also got interested in silk, is because magicians use silk. We use a lot of, colored fabrics for, vanishing, appearing, etc. And actually, we always refer to them as silk, because in the old days, they used to be silk. Now they're mostly polyester. But there's a very interesting story that takes us to the world of James Randi. James Randi was one of the greatest skeptics who ever lived. His training originally was as a magician. And as any magician, he was reviled by the use of magic in a dishonorable way. We like to say that magicians are honest charlatans. A magician will never imply that whatever he or she does is done by paranormal means. It's just that the audience doesn't know the means that are used. But there are people who use magicians' tricks in order to fool people. Psychic surgery is one of those examples. And that's what James Randi is doing here, performing psychic surgery. Psychic surgeons usually are uneducated peasants in the Philippines or in South America who claim to be able to remove tumors from the body without making an incision. And it's very impressive when you see it. And that's what Randi is doing here. He's demonstrating how you can remove from the body a tumor, which actually isn't a tumor. It's a piece of cotton soaked in red dye, but it looks very, very impressive. Of course, this is absolutely fraudulent. This is done by sleight of hand. Actually, if I have a piece of silk, I can show you. That the psychic surgeon, in this case the physician, would reach into a patient's body, first show that they have nothing, reach into a patient's body, dig around a little bit, and then take out what really looks like.
Oh, could you please pick up the microphone? We can't hear you in the back.
I can't because I need both hands.
Oh, okay.
So that would be the tumor that is removed. But also, what I can do, what they normally don't do, is put it back into the body, make it vanish. So it's very impressive, right? Anyway, so that's the reason that I also got interested in silk, because it is used in such magic tricks, aside from the fact that silkworms are so fascinating. And when they hatch and become the moth, and then you have the procreation of the moth, so there's just a lot of fascinating science there. But anyway, this, of course, is something that we refer to as a natural fiber, right? Silk is made by a living creature. This really is biotechnology in action, right? We're using a living system to create a useful material. I mean, obviously, though, there is a lot of technology that's involved, because these days silk is usually dyed. You can get it in all colors. And when you weave it, there are different weaves. But anyway, silk is very expensive, which is one of the reasons that scientists were able to come up with synthetic fibers, which basically are laboratory creations. We can make all kinds of fibers in the laboratory. The usual starting material is petroleum. Now, petroleum, or crude oil, is a complex mixture of hundreds of different substances. People think that petroleum is one thing. No, it is a very, very complex mixture. That's why we need petroleum refineries. And petroleum refineries separate the different components of petroleum, depending on boiling point differences. And then they will take some of those components, and the term that is used is crack them, heat them until they break down into much smaller molecules, which are the ones that I showed you there. So in petroleum refining, you take crude oil, you heat it. By virtue of differences in boiling point, you separate them into components like gasoline, heating oil, jet fuel, etc. And you can take some of those and then heat them further and crack them and make them into small molecules. And then you can use those small molecules to form polymers. Polymers are giant molecules made by joining small molecules together. This is how synthetic fibers are made. If you have small molecules of ethylene, join them together, you get polyethylene. If you want spandex, which is what we're going to talk about, you have to have the right kind of small molecules to join them together. Now, spandex is a fascinating fiber, and I've chosen this one because it's sort of the antithesis of silk. This is a completely laboratory-made concoction. The word itself is interesting. It is just a rearrangement of expand, which is exactly what it does. The first time that the public really became aware of what spandex can do was in the 1966 version of Batman. Batman wore a spandex suit, a form-fitting spandex suit. But it was not the quality of spandex that we have today. And you can see the difference because Spider-Man looks much, much better than Batman looked back then because it is totally form-fitting and it stretches. It really is a fascinating material. So a little bit of history here. It was developed at DuPont by Joseph Shivers, and it was in the 1950s. What was he trying to do? Believe it or not, he was trying to come up with a substitute material that could be used for rubber in the making of girdles. Girdles were very popular back then, and they were made of rubber. But there was a shortage of rubber because so much rubber had been used during the Second World War. So he was looking for some sort of a substitute. Now, by this time, polymer chemistry was pretty well on its way. In the 1930s, nylon had been made by Carruthers, also at DuPont. So they knew how to join together small molecules to make long ones. But he hit upon a way of using two different kinds of small molecules to join them together end to end to make a material that was stretchy, and that became spandex. And I mean, the chemistry here, of course, is involved, and I don't want to go into that, but the point is that when you build this polymer, you build them out of about two segments, one of which is rigid, and the other one is very, very flexible and rubbery. And spandex worked. The girdles made of spandex were better than the ones that had been made of rubber. But of course, today, when you think of spandex, you don't think of girdles. Girdles are kind of a bygone era, right? You think of stuff, like that, athletic wear, swimwear, etc. So it's interesting to see how swimwear evolved over the years until now. Of course, it's all spandex. Remember these days? When you went to the beach and this is what you would wear, quite different, right, than from what we wear today. Let's take a look at Johnny Weissmuller, who in 1924 at the Paris Olympics wore a swimsuit like that, but became extremely famous. Why? What did he do before Tarzan? What did he do at the Olympics? Swimming, yes, and what? He won the gold, but more than that. The first sub 1 minute 100 meters. That was a huge thing. 100 meters, in a 50-meter pool, there and back, in under a minute. That had never been done before. So Johnny Weissmuller was the one who did that. And also interesting to connect to our superfood story, he was a faithful follower of John Harvey Kellogg and his biological living. In fact, Weissmuller went to the sanitarium that Kellogg founded in Battle Creek, Michigan, where exercise was in vogue. That was one of the things that the patients did beside eating the cereal. And Kellogg also believed in swimming. And Weissmuller was there. He was invited to open the indoor swimming pool. That was a huge deal back in those days, And he was feted there because, of course, he believed in Kellogg's so-called biological living. But anyway, after his swimming career, Johnny Weissmuller became Tarzan, and a number of films. But the swimsuit that he wore in those Olympics, what a difference from Caleb Dressel, who in the 2020 Olympics wore, of course, spandex and swam in 47.02 seconds, the 100 meters. I mean, that is unbelievable. That's like it's a human motor churning through the water. His diet, also interesting to think about. Superfoods, for breakfast, oatmeal. He also liked his chocolate milk, grilled chicken and vegetables for lunch, and his favorite was meatloaf. This was the world's top-notch swimmer. And by the way, just to show you that sometimes you can, eat something just because you like it, forget about the rest of the diet. He's become a spokesperson for Reese's. So no superfoods there. But the first time that spandex appeared in the Olympics was in 1973. Cornelia Ender was the East German swimmer. I think she won. This was, she eventually in the Montreal Olympics in 76, she won 4 gold medals. She was really something. And people said that it's because of the swimsuit, because of course you have much less resistance in the water. I think it had more to do with the East Germans' use of steroids, which they were really into. And I know that in 1976, I had the chance, I worked in a lab at the Montreal Olympics where we were doing some testing, and I met Cornelia Ender. And her muscular body was amazing. I mean, it was like, it was like a male structure. There's no question that they were doing steroids. But they also did have the spandex swimsuits. And over the years, spandex expanded to include full body suits, which became illegal because it gave too much of an advantage to the swimmers who had it, because it so reduced the friction with the water. And then along came Michael Phelps, who was not only the greatest swimmer ever, but the greatest Olympian. He holds a record that is unlikely to ever be broken. 28 medals. I mean, it's phenomenal. Anyway, so they tried different types of swimsuits. This is also a Lycra, but it's got some polyurethane panels in it in order to cut down friction. So this is no longer allowed. So what did the greatest swimmer in the history of the world, or maybe the greatest athlete in the history of the world, did he eat superfoods? For breakfast, Michael Phelps had a sandwich with eggs. For lunch, cheese and bologna sandwich. And for supper, he had pasta and pizza. Not exactly in the superfood category. Well, over the years, the swimsuits evolved. And here are the current models. The full suit is no longer allowed for men, and there are specifications that have to be met, but it is all spandex. Of course, it's not only swimmers who use spandex. Any time when you really need form fitting, in order to cut down on air resistance, you go for spandex. And in bicycle racing, where differences can be measured in hundredths of a second, what you wear makes a tremendous difference because of the friction against the air. I mean, if instead of a spandex suit, you just wore a t-shirt, the time would be reduced tremendously because of, of the air resistance. So yeah, bicyclists, of course, will wear spandex, and the same thing for skiers, where also time makes a tremendous difference. And since then, of course, spandex has even gotten into everyday life, and it's become a common clothing item because it is such a useful fabric, and it stretches and it's comfortable. But there are some opponents. People who say, well, no, we shouldn't be using synthetic materials. We shouldn't be using plastics. Spandex really is a form of plastic. And this kind of thing irritates me. I mean, there are issues with plastics for sure, but there's no life without them. There would be no airplanes without plastic. They're lightweight. If you look in your car, everything is made of plastic. Our construction is based on plastic, from the plumbing to the insulating materials. If you go to a hospital, everywhere you look, virtually everything in that picture is made of plastic. There's no life without it. The cell phones that you use are made of plastic. The commercial items, whether they be medications or cosmetics, are packaged in plastic. You can't have your blueberries in the middle of winter, which you should have, if it wasn't for plastic. How would you transport them? But it doesn't mean that we give a free pass to plastic in all forms of life. For example, is there a need to package every cucumber in shrink wrap? And you would say, I think, automatically, no, this is a waste. We shouldn't be using plastic for that. Why? First of all, because plastic means you're using up petroleum, and also because we discard it and it breaks down into microplastics, nanoplastics, etc. But it's very interesting in science. As soon as you scratch the surface and you start looking deeper into a story, it changes. There's a reason to do this. It's not because a farmer or a store says, gee, we're not spending enough money. Let's go out and buy some shrink wrap and put it around our cucumbers to scare our customers away. If they do it, it's for a reason. Well, first of all, let's look at what shrink wrap is. Shrink wrap can be made from several different kinds of plastics. And the interesting thing here is that the molecules, the polymers of these plastics, tend to be coiled into like little balls. But when you take the plastic and you physically stretch the plastic, you actually stretch out the molecules so they line up with each other. But then when you apply heat, they go back to their original configuration. This is what shrink wrap is about. So for example, if you want to shrink wrap these bottles, first you would take the plastic is stretched, it is put around the bottles, then you apply heat and it shrinks and it seals it completely. All right, now why would you do this to cucumbers? For a very good reason. It reduces moisture loss, it reduces the shriveling. You don't want to buy a shriveled cucumber. It reduces contact with the air, So it means that it doesn't spoil as easily because air in contact with many food components, especially fats, will cause rancidity. So what this means is that those English cucumbers that are wrapped in plastic will last much, much longer, which these days is an important thing because 1/3 of all the food that is produced gets thrown out. Now think about that. What a statistic that is. Especially when you consider that 1/3 of the world goes to bed hungry every night. So look at that inequality. We are throwing out 1/3 of our food and 1/3 of the world is going hungry. If you don't wrap those English cucumbers, they will spoil quickly. And that means that they end up being thrown out. And when you do the calculations, it turns out that a cucumber that discarded due to spoilage has the environmental impact of 93 plastic wraps. How do we calculate that? Because to grow a cucumber, okay, there's a lot of transportation involved. There's the fertilizers, the insecticides that are transported, and there's a transporting of the cucumber. All of that has environmental impact. So if that cucumber eventually gets thrown out, all of what you have spent on it is lost. So next time you see that English cucumber wrapped in plastic in the supermarket, realize that there's a reason for that, because it will make it last much longer, and it is to your benefit. Now, one final story. Plastics also have played a role in the photography. And of course, the plastic we're talking about here is celluloid. And celluloid is made by taking cellulose, which is the basic component of plants. It's the most widely used material in the world. And when you react it with nitric acid, sulfuric acid, you get nitrocellulose, which can be made into celluloid. But the reason I'm telling you this story is because of another story that is in the book. And this starts with Heinrich Hoffmann, who was Hitler's official photographer. And Hitler loved to have his picture taken. He would often pose for pictures. And Hoffmann was very highly regarded by Hitler. Here is a group picture. There is, of course, is Hitler in the middle, and there is Hoffmann. And standing very close to Hoffmann, right there, that is Dr. Theodor Morell, who became Hitler's physician. And the reason this happened is because Hoffmann had stomach problems, and Morell was his physician, and he gave him Mutaflor, which was a concoction made of live bacteria, very much like yogurt. In fact, Morell said that he had been educated by the Russian Mechnikov, who had come up with the idea that live bacteria are beneficial, which wasn't true. He had nothing to do with Mechnikov. But anyway, Hoffmann was very happy that this stuff worked for him. And Hitler had terrible digestive problems. And Hoffmann recommended Morell to Hitler. And he became his personal physician. And he prescribed Hitler all kinds of things, including this Vitamolten, which was a concoction that Morell had made up. He had a company that made this. And he would inject Hitler with this. And Hitler said that whenever he was injected, he was refreshed and invigorated. Well, interesting enough, it turns out that Dr. Morell was not liked by Heinrich Himmler. And here's Himmler with Hoffmann. Interesting picture. So anyway, Himmler did not like Morell. And he had this Vitamolten with which the Führer was injected. He had it chemically analyzed. He wanted to know what was in there. How come it really made him feel better? Well, what was in there was methamphetamine. The same stuff that the Germans used quite widely in the Second World War as Pervitin. It was given to pilots, it was given to soldiers, because of course amphetamine will really rev you up. Morel treated Hitler with codeine, cocaine, testosterone, sulfonamide, oxycodone, belladonna, bile extracts, morphine, barbiturates. Hitler was sick all the time. Now, the interesting thing here is the last one, strychnine. Okay? Strychnine is extracted from a tree, and in very small doses, it's a stimulant, like caffeine, which is the reason that he was given that. It's also used as rat poison, right? So the only trouble here is that Morel didn't give Hitler enough strychnine. No. So anyway, as you can see, there are so many interesting stories and connections that you can make in science. And that's what, that's what I normally try to do. And that's what we did, hopefully with some success in Superfoods, Silkworms, and Spandex. And now you have some idea of why. If you want more stories, of course, there's lots of this kind of stuff on our website. And if you just go there, you want to sign up for a newsletter, it's very easy to do with one click, and you'll get some interesting stories. And I wish I had some books here for you, but I don't, because I cannot buy them as cheaply as you can buy them on Amazon. That's a fact, because of course Amazon buys in bulk. So the best deal for any book is on Amazon. So if you're interested, that's where you can get them. Okay, so questions? Yeah. In a test tube. Chemical reactions. I mean, to give you, what can I give you as the most simplest chemical reaction? I guess the simplest chemical reaction that you can experience is if you take some baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, and add vinegar, right? What you will see is the evolution of carbon dioxide. Those two react, they join together to form carbon dioxide. Well, polymers are the same kind of thing. If you have the two right kind of what we call monomers, they will join together. Well, of course, you have to have the right kind of coupling, at the end of the molecule. But obviously, it's a pretty sophisticated business. But polymer chemistry is well established. I mean, you can make all kinds of polymers. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, blueberry, we use the term blueberry, but there are several species of blueberries. There, I mean, just like there are different species of apples, right? There are different species of blueberries. Some are small, some are larger. In terms of nutrition, there's no difference. In terms of taste, I think there is a difference. I think the bigger ones taste better. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. The question is if they're making silk material, for sure. I mean, for example, Hermès, which is a French company, they make all kinds of silk scarves, silk ties, but those silk ties cost about $200. But I can also tell you that if you have a silk tie, necktie, the way that you can tie it is better than any other tie. It will form a nicer knot and it will hang nicer. I mean, silk is a great fabric. Yeah. Keep it on until you're ready to use it. Yeah, even in the fridge. Yeah. Yes. You keep it on as long as, yeah. But once you take it off, eat it. Why store it? Yeah. That's nonsense. I know, I see all those things all the time that you shouldn't combine. Incidentally, you know that botanically a banana is a berry. Yeah, you can ask a botanist and they'll tell you that the banana is a berry. I'm not exactly sure how the definition is, but it fits the berry definition. Something to do with where the seeds are. Yeah. Yeah. No, I don't say that. I say they're not different in nutritional value. As I said, the reason to buy organic, if you can afford it, is because its environmental footprint is smaller. Because you're not using as much fertilizer, you're not using the pesticides, which of course have to be manufactured and transported. But in terms of nutrition, I mean, if you measure vitamin content, mineral content, protein content, there's no difference. And then, you know, there's the question of the cost. I mean, you know, all the surveys show that people who buy only organic actually eat fewer fruits and vegetables because they're more expensive. Yeah. Yes, I mean, in theory, all plastics can be recycled. But theory is different from practice because it means that you have to collect them and you have to transport them to a recycling facility. And you have to have a market for the recycled material. So there are a lot of problems along the lines there. So for example, polystyrene, with those styrofoam cups, you know, and the styrofoam containers, etc. Okay? Those can be recycled. But the problem is that those are very light, very bulky. So if you load a truck up with the recycled material, the amount that you can actually transport, taking into account the gasoline that the truck uses to take it to the recycling facility, is not worth it. Okay, so these are all the things that you have to take into account. The one that there's no question works for recycling are the beverage bottles, the water bottles, the soft drink bottles, because those are very easily recycled. They are just chopped up, melted down, and they can be reformed into the same thing. So that's a crime to throw those out. But when it comes to other kind of plastics, it's much harder, especially because many of the plastics that we use are multi-layers. There's not one single material. And that makes it very hard to recycle. So, you know, the answer to recycling always is it's a complex answer. It depends on which material and also where you are located. You know, sorting is a huge problem. You know, if somehow we could get people, and this was tried actually, you may remember at one time our blue boxes had compartments, but people just don't do that. Because if we could just isolate the beverage bottles, that would be great. But as soon as you mix them together with paper and with all kinds of other stuff, the separation becomes a problem. I mean, if you would ever go to one of these separation plants, and these are, you know, huge establishments, but what you see is the stuff that comes in from the blue boxes gets dumped onto a conveyor belt, and there are people there physically sorting it. This is very labor intensive. I mean, there are some machines that will separate some plastics depending on density, on whether they float or don't float. But it's just labor, too much labor involved. And as you can imagine, like with everything else, it's a question of dollars and cents. It's, you know, does the bottom line make sense? I mean, recycling is not a philanthropic undertaking. I mean, recycling is a business. And they're only going to recycle it if there's a market for recycled product and if you can do it cheaply enough. Yeah. The what? Yes, I mean, but listen, that plastic bag does not decide by itself to jump into the ocean, okay? It's people who are the problem, as with everything else. It's the throwing away of things, right? I mean, how do all of those plastic cups and straws end up in the ocean? I mean, because people didn't put them into the right place. Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, the stuff that you do and put in the blue boxes, a lot of it does get recycled. Because we have, in Montreal, we do have recycling facilities. Yeah. But again, the problem is that people put everything in those recycling. Yeah. And, you know, I mean, you can imagine what that's like when you're working there and you're on this assembly line and you see all the, you know, the garbage together with the plastic, and you have to pick out the plastic. Yeah. Yeah. No, you have to get more serious about it. I mean, there are some places where they have the blue boxes, and there's 3 compartments in there. One for paper, one for clear plastic, and one for other plastic. And when they come and they see that it's not properly sorted, they dump it on your lawn. Yeah, that would be another thing, is they charge you. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, people, you know, people can be trained to do it properly. But I mean, right now here, it is a nightmare because people put everything in the blue box. Oh yeah, the glass goes with the plastic, yeah. Well, as far as recycling goes, the breaking is not a problem. It's actually a benefit because the glass gets broken down anyway in recycling. They crush the glass and they melt it and make new glass. So if it breaks, it doesn't matter. Oh yeah, glass absolutely should be recycled. And cans, food cans, that's also very easy to recycle because that's aluminum. Again, so that's criminal to throw those out. Aluminum is one of those materials that can be recycled over and over again, all, you know, infinitum, because it just melted down and you know, remade into new material. Yeah. It all depends on whether you're planning to get pregnant or not. If you're not planning to get pregnant, you can eat it as much as you want. I mean, the only problem with tuna, although the problem is less now, is the mercury. But that's only an issue of pregnancy and infancy. So I wouldn't worry about it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There would. It would last longer, but the vegetable oil lasts a very long time anyway. Because in the bottle, you basically exclude air anyway, you know, if the bottle is capped. So, yes, Yeah, yeah. And you know, in Europe, they don't keep butter in the fridge. They're crazy. The butter tastes better there, though. So it's what drives you crazy is that it's on the counter, not that it's full of fat that you're eating. All right, so we'll see you July 4th.